I am a philosophy professor, taught here since '99, and mostly what I teach is moral philosophy and social and political philosophy. So this stuff, the rights stuff, I know about, or at least I have views, or at least they let me teach people whether or not I know about it. Healthcare, not so much. I'm a consumer. Like most people probably, I have various views that are not particularly specially informed about healthcare. What I want to do is talk in general about rights. So I have a kind of talk about that's really philosophical and thinking about what talk about rights is, or ways of thinking about what we're doing when we're talking about rights. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I understand that to carry over to thinking about healthcare. But that's really going to be pretty small scale and tentative and suggestive rather than any kind of comprehensive thesis, because I don't really have a comprehensive thesis beyond sort of what I say here. So I'll say what I have to say, and then we can open it up and talk about it. And very likely there will be things that I can learn from you guys about your thinking, being in the field, thinking about being involved professionally in healthcare in ways that won't occur to me, since it could be a really bad mistake to have me involved for my field. Okay, so I want to start with some basic points about rights. So the first point is that everybody believes in rights, and it's worthwhile, I think, pointing this out, because very often when we get in discussion with others about rights, it's for a variety of reasons. It's very attractive to make claims on others based on rights and demands about rights. And it's easy sort of to think that, well, you know, my team has rights on its side, and, you know, these poor schmoes that I'm arguing with somehow just don't believe in rights or something. And that's true of hardly anybody. Everybody believes in rights. That's not really an issue. What's at stake is, what rights do we have? Or how should we understand the rights that we have? So we've got to move beyond thinking that somehow there's something really impressive about being able to say, yeah, we have these rights, you know, and pounding the table, to going beyond that and recognize, yeah, everybody knows that. The question is, why think that we have the rights that my view has? So to make progress with those who disagree with us and thinking about rights, somehow we've got to go beyond just asserting that we have rights. And the way that I'm proposing to do that here is by thinking a little bit about what rights are. So doing a little bit of philosophical analysis on the idea of rights. And secondly, looking at why they matter. And this is not a practical why they matter, it's sort of why they matter from a philosophical dimension. Why do we care about claims about rights? And the way that I want to come at this is I want to start with the idea that we're entitled to equal rights. So I'll explain that a little bit as I go on, but I'm taking that as being sort of an axiom. I'm taking it that we certainly in liberal societies accept the idea that people are equally entitled to rights. And that at the very least, if you want to assert that some people have rights that other people don't, you have some explaining to do, right? Because that's at least the default position. I think that's an old, relatively old default position, not in human history, but in Western societies, going back at least to the 17th century. It seems to me like a really important default position to have. And I think most of us agree on it, so I don't think that's really contentious. Okay, what I want to do is suggest that we think of rights, claims about rights, saying I have a right to this or you have a right to that. Think about that in terms of asserting a kind of authority over others. So a connection between rights and authority. And the kind of authority that I have in mind, and I'll be explaining this as I go, is an authority to obligate other people. So if I claim that I have some kind of right against you, I'm claiming that I obligate you in some way, and that I have the authority to make you be obligated in virtue of making that, asserting that claim about rights. If we're going to see ourselves as having equal rights, that means our capacity to obligate each other through our rights claims has to be equal. We can't think that some of us have greater capacity to obligate than others. That's incompatible with seeing us as equal in moral authority. And so that means the rights that we have against each other are going to have to be equal, as I indicated earlier. And my claim is that that can help us see what rights we have. So understanding the connection between having rights, obligating other people, having the authority to obligate other people, and thinking that has to be equal, and thinking that provides a certain kind of filter that is going to allow through some claims that people have rights, or rights that some people want to claim, and it's going to filter out others. That's the case that I'm going to make. So the things I have to do in doing this are, number one, to say what rights are. So the idea here is to say what it means to have a right. What are we doing? What's the content of what we're asserting when we claim that we have rights? Number one, and that's where the idea of obligation will come in, so I'll explain. And then number two, consider what rights that we might have, we think we have equal entitlement to. That's my plan for the next few minutes. Okay, so let's start with this. What are we saying when we say that you have a right of some sort? This is perfectly general. Any kind of right that you might think of, from the right to life to right to take an open chair in the room, doesn't really matter. It's trivial, serious, whatever. When we use rights language, what are we doing? Well, we're doing probably a number of things, but at the heart of the whole thing is the idea that we're saying other people have some kind of obligation. It doesn't make sense to think of a claim to rights independently of thinking that means there's stuff that other people owe it to me to do. They're obligated to do. Right? So there's moral obligation, or legal, if we're talking about legal rights, legal obligation. Here, my focus is going to be moral rights. So there's a moral obligation on the part of other people to do something. Either to do something or to refrain from doing something. They can go in either direction. So, an example, saying you have a right to your kidney means that others are obligated, amongst other things, not to take your kidney without your permission. Right? They have that obligation to you. If they take your kidney without your permission, they've wronged you. Right? They've committed a moral wrong against you, and they're accountable to you for doing it. So, all those are in the idea of that particular right. And for any given right, we'll have to fiddle with that. The obligations vary, and some of them are more complex than others. But that's the basic idea, is rights are tracking obligations that people have to each other. There's different kinds of rights, and the different kinds of rights that we have are tied to different kinds of obligations. So obligations on the one hand to do things, or obligations not to do things, depending on the right. And this distinction, whether or not the obligations for the rights associated with the rights are to do or not to do, allow us to draw a distinction between kinds of rights that's very often made between positive and negative rights. And I'm going to use that distinction. It's not philosophically unproblematic, but for the most part, it's going to track some distinctions that are pretty commonsensical. At least I'm going to try to make out a way of understanding that distinction. So let's talk first about positive rights. So these are called, positive rights are so called because they correspond to others, they correspond to obligations that others have to do something. Right? There's a demand that they actually do something. There's positive action that's required by this obligation, hence the name positive rights. These are sometimes also known as welfare rights. That's probably more old-fashioned language, but they often go under this name for reasons that may become clear. So here's an example. If you have a right not to go hungry, that means that somebody else has an obligation to do something positive. In particular, they have an obligation to provide you with food. Right? So there's the right, you have a right not to go hungry. There's an associated obligation with it, and that obligation is a positive thing. Other people, somebody else owes you to provide you food. And that's the sense in which right not to go hungry would be a positive right. Negative rights. As the name suggests, these correspond to obligations that others have not to do something, right? Or to refrain from doing something. But the key idea is there's nothing that's required from them in the way that there is in the case of positive rights. And these rights, for reasons that may become apparent, are also known as liberty rights. In that terminology has to some degree sort of faded out, but you still find that sometimes. So, example of negative right, if you have a right not to be assaulted, which I take it most of us think we have, what is the obligation that's associated with that? Well, it's an obligation on others not to hit you. Right? That's what they owe it to you to do. They owe it to you not to do something, namely hit you or assault you in one way or another. Okay, that's the basic framework of positive versus negative rights. So here's the idea, is that negative rights or liberty rights have an important advantage over positive or welfare rights. They are composable. So compossibility, this is a term only a philosopher could love. It's actually a somewhat more precise idea than the distinction between positive and negative rights, but it lines up pretty carefully. And we can give a pretty careful definition of what it is for rights to be composable. So rights are composable when one person's right can be observed or respected without coming at the expense of the observing or respecting of that same right for somebody else. They're not in tension, they're not in conflict. The way that economists would put this is they're non-rivals. You guys had econ classes where we talked about rivalry? Yeah. So, composable rights are rights where the obligations involved are non-rivals. If you're not an economist, and it's like, yeah, don't talk to me about rivalry, compossibility in terms of rivalry, because I don't know what either one of those means. It just means there's no cost in terms of you're satisfying one person's right at the expense of the other. That's compossibility. So, here's an example of the way this difference works. So I can respect Joe's right not to be assaulted, his liberty right, without in any way compromising Barack's right not to be assaulted. Right? It doesn't cost anything in the observance of Barack's right for me to observe that right for Joe. There's no tension there whatsoever. But if I give food to John to satisfy my obligation corresponding to his welfare right, his positive right not to go hungry, right, then I no longer have that food available. So if we think that Harry has that same positive right, now I am out of food to be able to satisfy that right. So what's the story here? The story that I'm telling is, this right is compossible, this one is not. Here I can satisfy the obligation associated with this right for one person only by losing my capacity to satisfy that obligation to somebody else. Does that make sense? The contrast and compossibility in those cases? Okay. Why does that matter? Well, the way that I want that to matter, the story that I want to tell is, it goes back to the idea that we want to be equally authoritative. We want to see ourselves as having equal authority to obligate other people. Right? So what I'm going to claim is that compossibility allows for a form of equality that's not possible otherwise. It's not possible without compossibility. We can think of ourselves as equally entitled to respect for compossible rights, as equally authoritative in obligating others in ways that compossible rights track. Or put it the other way, we obligate each other equally in compossible rights. So the point here, going back to my example, Joe and Barack are equally authoritative in the obligations that they impose on us not to assault. Right? There's no problem with seeing them as equally authoritative because there's no cost to the one in satisfying the one in terms of our capacity to satisfy the other. But with non-compossible rights, that's not the case. In the case of non-compossible rights, the rights of some can be respected only by according lesser force to the rights of others. Right? We're going to have to choose. We've got a limited amount of food, and we are thinking that people have rights to be hungry. We're going to have the right not to be hungry. We're going to have to think about where we send that food. And we're going to have to make choices. And when we do that, we're reflecting a decision that the obligations that some people impose on us not to go hungry are of lesser force than the obligations that others impose on us not to go hungry. Does that make sense? That's, to me, is the key difference. So we have to make a choice between the authority that John and Harry have to obligate us to satisfy those rights, because they're non-compossible. John and Harry cannot be equally authoritative. We've got to see them as having differential moral authority. If we're going to be equal in our capacity to obligate others, we must be equal in our rights. And if our rights are going to be equally authoritative, that means they have to be composable rights. The connection I'm drawing is between welfare rights and a lack of equal moral authority. And on the other hand, composable rights and equal moral authority. That's the connection I'm trying to establish here. So, that's sort of the framework of thought. What I want to do here fairly quickly is go through what rights I think make the composability cut. We can come back and talk about these if you want to push me on these. I'll do this and then turn a little bit and conclude with talking about what this might mean for thinking about healthcare rights. So this is sort of the standard, probably classical liberal conception of rights. It starts with rights or claim. Claim rights are especially strong rights where we think each of us has interest in the kind of control that claim rights respect. Other people keep your hands off. Right? That's the nature of claim rights. The right that you have to take a chair, empty chair in the room is not a claim right. That's something that's also called liberty right. But we're less worried with those for many of these cases. So we're going to start with claim rights going all the way back to Locke. Right? Locke sort of starts this tradition saying we have claims to our bodies and bodily integrity. Right? This is why why we have rights not to have our kidneys taken, because we have rights over our bodies that are claim rights. And they're composable. Rights to our labor. Right? You are not, others are obligated not to enslave you. Right? Slavery is a gross violation of the right that we have to control our own labor. To hold property. Right? Each one of us is entitled to be able to make property claims on each other. I'll come back to that in just a minute. And to obligate ourselves voluntarily through contract. This is very often overlooked, but I think actually the right to contract is a really, very morally, it's easy to overlook it and really, really morally important that we see ourselves as able to enter into contract. All of these are composable rights, and I'll talk a little bit about the last two here because they're the ones that are for the most part. I mean, if somebody says, no, I don't see really that you have a right for me against my enslaving you. That's going to be a different conversation, right? That's very likely going to be a conversation that you're going to be wanting to hold a baseball bat or a gun for, right? That's not really polite conversation when somebody says, no, I think I can enslave you. That's not really such a big issue. Okay. Why is property part of the story? After all, I mean, this is a live wire question. Because obviously the property holdings that we have are pretty significantly unequal. So the story that I want to tell is to say, yeah, but that's not the right level of analysis here. What we really want to look at is the ways in which we are obligating each other, the authority that we have to obligate each other through our property claims. Because that's what it means to have a property right. To claim property is to assert that other people have obligations, right? Your property right in your sandwich means that I have to leave it alone. I am obligated to leave your food alone. It's true for any kind of property, your car, house, right, lawnmower, whatever it is. That's my obligation. But there's a significant moral benefit to having property rights. And there's lots of, right, I guess you had better in here. If you have economists in here, they're going to be telling you about all the wonderful things that property rights do to make people better off. And I do not question that story. I think that story is true. My story is different. I want to talk about the moral benefits of property rights. What the moral benefit is that having property rights is a way of circumscribing a sphere of the world in which you are authoritative. Meaning you get to decide what happens to that part of the world. And you get to do it without stepping on anybody else's toes. The property that you own is under your authority and nobody else's. So you don't have to ask other people's permission to act on the world, to exercise your authority on the world. Right? You're not subordinate to the decision-making of other people's authority in that part of the world over which you have property. And that's a really valuable thing. And I think that's what allows for the development of civil society. I think there's a non-accidental relationship between property and civility. I think history bears that out. It's a moral point, right, aside from the economic point. So a system of property rights, by system I mean a whole story about how property is acquired, how it's transferred, also how disputes are adjudicated, because let's be honest, there never has been nor will be a society of human beings in which we don't need arbitration and adjudication between disputes. We're a disputatious species. So part of this system of adjudications was required to give us equal authority. It's not equal property, but equal authority to obligate others through the property that we hold. And that, I claim, is a reflection of our equal standing as being able to obligate other people as moral agents. Contract. Why is contract here? What is contract but a way of obligating ourselves? Right? If I make an agreement with you, I sign, this would be a little bit specious, but we sign a contract by which you help me paint my house today in return for my washing your car next week. Amongst the other things that I'm doing is I'm saying, I'm obligated to show up at your house to wash your car next week. I now have a moral obligation, which without my signing that contract, I would not have. There's no way that you can claim that I'm wronging you by not showing up to wash your car unless I have obligated myself. That's what contracts do. Contracts are ways that we obligate ourselves, which sounds like a bad thing. I think it's very easy to, one of the reasons why the importance of contract gets overlooked is it's really easy to overlook how valuable it is to us that we are able to obligate ourselves. This is a privilege that we allow grown-up, competent human beings. There's a substantial part of our population that we deny the authority to execute contracts. When you think of the population slice that I'm thinking of?
Prisoners?
Children. Yeah. Not recognizing people's authority to contract as a way of infantilizing them. It's a way of treating them as not responsible for themselves or their lives. And in a way, that sounds pretty good. It sounds like a free lunch, but it's not. Right? When I teach this class or teach these ideas to undergraduates that are, maybe 18 or 19 years old, and have within the last year or two been at home, right, as seniors in high school, absolutely bristling against the controls that they're under as kids, and thinking, man, I cannot wait to move out of this place and be on my own, be in charge of my own life, right? What they want is, put me on the hook, let me assume responsibility for my own life. And freshmen and sophomores get this point, because it's really fresh in their minds what it's like to be without it. It's a big moral benefit. And I think we overlook this at our peril. Right? So the right to contract is a way of saying you have the authority over yourself, you can take on obligations, and we will hold you to it. Right? This is a two-edged sword. Okay, so I want to switch over to, this is my little appendix here. Pasted on here for the purposes of trying to, so this is the way I was thinking about what this framework might mean for you guys, sort of looking ahead and thinking, zoomed out from 30,000 feet about healthcare policy. So if I think about rights to healthcare, that's actually kind of a pretty sloppy idea, rights to healthcare. But I think there's two things that people often mean. And this is my first stab at sort of trying to come up with this. I was thinking, well, I can think of this as a negative right, or I can think of it as a positive right. So what would the negative right be? The negative right is that others have no right to interfere with the arrangements we make for our health care. That's a negative right, because their obligation is, don't mess with me. You don't have to do anything, just stay at home, right? Just shut up, just keep your hands off me. Let me make such arrangements for my health care as I want. That's perfectly intelligible as a negative right. Does that sound right to you guys? Okay. Obviously, the positive right is something different. Positive right would be an entitlement to be provided with health care. A positive right would correspond with an obligation of somebody to provide me with health care services. And so my thought is, well, starting to think or say sensible things about rights to health care sort of depends on which way we're thinking about rights to health care. So if we think about it as a positive right, well, we have a story here on which we have a right to have others provide us with goods and services. We need to be healthy, something like that. But of course, those goods and services are scarce or rivalrous. You guys are thinking about being some of the goods and services that people might want, and no doubt you are aware of the fact that you are finite. If you are in one place doing one thing, you cannot be someplace else doing something else. That's just the facts of life. So these are scarce and rivalrous, so that means these rights are incompossible. It means choosing to provide those goods and services to some people is simultaneously at the same time a choice not to honor that right or not to see others who have the same claim, to see them as equally obligatory. Right? You're going to have to choose who has the greater obligating power. Who's more authoritative? Means seeing people as not equally authoritative. So we would have to be unequal in authority to obligate for this to be so, for us to think that we have these rights, because they're not possible if we construe them in the positive way. As a negative right, the story is different. We have a right to make such arrangements for providing or consuming health care goods and services as we choose, and others agree to exchange with us. You know, I was thinking as I was doing this, well, this is pretty trivial. Who doesn't agree with this? Government of Great Britain, government of Canada. Right? I gather some of those things are changing, but those are places in which there has been statutory limitation on people's capacity to enter into contracts voluntarily, right? I'm not talking about compelling anything. You're a healthcare provider, I'm a healthcare consumer. I'd like to buy some of your services. Depending on what your services are, we may or may not be able to carry out that contract. Right? The state is going to interfere and tell us, no, sorry, you can't. Even though both of you agree, even though both of you would be better off, you can't do it. So that would be an infringement of this right to health care consumed negatively. But there's no scarcity or rivalry involved. So these are impossible rights. And so the way I read this, that means we can claim these. These are compatible with equal authority. And my general argument is that's a compelling reason to take rights to health care in the negative vein seriously, and to discount rights to health care in the positive way not so. Because the positive construal is incompatible with our seeing each other as having equal moral authority to obligate each other. To me, as a moral philosopher, that seems to me like a really significant reason. Right? This is going back to my saying the stake in the ground here is that we're moral equals. So I think if you want to defend this right, you have to find some way of doing that in some way that's compatible with that, or you have to give up moral equality, which most people are not going to be willing to do. But that's what I think equality of authority to obligate requires. And that's it. So, that's my idea. So, questions, comments, arguments, rebuttals? Yes, sir?
So when people are saying, I have a right to health care, and yields things out like Obamacare,
Yeah.
not quite clear what type of right are they really talking about there?
I think for the most part, they're thinking of it as a positive right. That, I think in the healthcare debate here, unlike Canada and the UK, and maybe other, I'm not sure about other places. For the most part, the idea is if I'm in need, somebody has an obligation to care for that need. So if I have appendicitis, somebody has the obligation of treating me for that. And one of the things that's very difficult about thinking about these kinds of positive rights is it's not clear who that somebody is.
Yeah, so if I have a right to be healthy, who makes me healthy? God or what? I mean, I don't understand.
Yeah, so probably, so that I'm phrasing it as a right to health care, because I think usually it's not a, so if there's a right to be healthy, it's just a negative. I don't know, right? So that'd be, I don't have the right to, you know.
But health care is the other.
Health care, I'm thinking of it as a provision of goods and services. And so it's those who are in position. So I think this is a question that's not asked, number one. If you push and you ask the question, I think there's one of two things that's lying behind it. That might be behind it if I'm saying that I have a right to health care construed in a positive way. One is that it might be that societies who it is that has the obligation, right? So somehow we collectively, those of us who are in society, right, we have the obligation to tax ourselves or, do whatever. But one of the worries here is this is just a free-floating obligation that sort of hits everybody without it really being clear who exactly it is. In the case of my right not to be assaulted, there's a different sense in which it's everybody's responsibility. Right? My right not to be assaulted, well, my right against them. Who has the obligation? Well, you do. But so do you. Everybody does, individually. When it comes to something like healthcare, that's not, the idea is not that each one of us has the obligation to provide healthcare, it's that we do. Right? There's some kind of umbrella we that's responsible. That's one idea. The second one is, and this I think has some traction in some contexts. If you're are you a doctor?
You're
aspiring. At some point, you will be a doctor. And in virtue of that, it's your obligation. Right? In virtue of your acquiring these skills, you take on this obligation in a way that I, as a humble philosopher, will never do. Because I don't have, right, I maybe could do the Heimlich maneuver. That would be about the extent of it.
Well, I wish I took your course because I don't view, and this might be sacrilege in this room while I'm sitting back here, but I don't believe that healthcare is a right, positive nor negative. I think it's a privilege, but you can cover privileges versus rights,
sure.
And that's the main
privilege. The idea that it's a privilege is compatible with the negative construal, right? Okay. All that says is my right to healthcare construed negatively means that nobody else gets to tell me what to do. That also means nobody else gets to tell you what to do. So if you don't want to provide your goods and services,
so it's just a
hands
semantical
off.
difference then.
I'm sorry?
It's plain semantics. Privilege
that would be a
is
terminological
negative,
difference.
Okay.
That's right. Right. So the idea there is that right. So you and I might enter into a voluntary arrangement where I say, hey, I pay you, you treat me, and on the other hand, you say, you know what? You're a jerk. I'm not treating you. And damn it. Okay, I can't. I don't have the. You have the right to participate in this voluntarily as well. It's respect for your right to contract. If you say, I don't want to deal with you, nobody else. Right? Your negative right means nobody else gets to tell you otherwise. That's a choice that's reserved to you.
Thank you.
You implied that there was no issues of scarcity with negative rights.
Yes.
One of the arguments for national health care is that we live in an environment of scarce resources, and therefore you have to have some control, a positive right, but with control measures to equally distribute all the resources.
Yeah.
And this speaks to a Keynesian philosophy versus other economic philosophies that says that we have a fixed amount of pie versus an expandable amount of pie. So I wonder if you comment briefly about a society with the concept of negative rights and the issue of why there would be no scarcity in that market.
Well, negative rights require that you literally do nothing. So the question isn't, it's hard to see that there's relevant scarcity there precisely because there's zero opportunity cost. Are you guys comfortable with the idea of opportunity cost? Opportunity cost is what you have to give up in order to exercise an option. So every choice that you make, there is no free lunch. Every choice that you make has opportunity costs, except apparently this one. Right? The opportunity cost for my respecting your right not to be assaulted is zero relative to everybody else's right against me that I don't assault them. It's opportunity cost free. This is the proverbial free lunch. The negative right, the obligation that I have to do nothing, because I'm really pretty good at doing nothing. And it's very easy and it's costless, right? So that's the sense in which it gets really hard to get a scarcity claim going there. Now, the other question is, given that there is scarcity with respect to healthcare goods and services, like anything else, like food, like housing, like clothes, like cars, like pretty much any economic good, anything that has a price on it, right? How do we cope with that scarcity? That's a good question. One of the arguments that I want to make, that economists would want to make about regimes of property rights, is that property rights do a good job of pushing back the boundaries of scarcity. Right? We have far more food than we would have in a regime in which the rights to own property and make it productive for producing food. Right? Because we've had private property and farming is private, turns out People eat really well, right? You deprive people of property, of the right to own property that's productive of food, and people literally starve. This is not a, right? So in both cases, in the economist terms, there's scarcity of food, but one of those scarcities is multiple orders of magnitude different than the other, right? Or you might say the problem of scarcity has changed. It changes so much in degree that it becomes a change in time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not making scarcity go away, but it's changing the scarcity issue. So I think, well, that model of thinking about scarcity holds here too. No matter what we do, there's going to be scarcity in healthcare goods and services. We could want more. Right? Maybe in an ideal world, I would have my own personal physician, right, watching, checking in on me 2 or 3 times a day, to make sure that, but in the real world, having my own personal physician would be staggeringly expensive. There's no way we could do that. It'd be great, but that's never going to happen. That's just too costly. It costs too much in other resources. So what we want to do is think, well, what kinds of arrangements can we make in order to push back that boundary of scarcity as well? But that I see that's an economic problem, and all I would say here is claim it's a poor way to go. To start by saying we have equal positive rights to health care. That doesn't solve the problem, and it creates, I think, a moral problem in that we have to start privileging some people's rights over others. If I have a positive right to health care, and you're the local physician, right? One of us is going to have more, and you don't want to treat me. One of us is going to have more capacity to obligate than others. Right? If the story is by law that you're obligated to treat me, right? I'm the one who gets to obligate, you're the one who gets to be obligated, and that's it. We are not morally equal. So I think that's a poor way to come at thinking about the economic problem that undoubtedly is there. In thinking about scarcity and more general economics. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes absolute sense, and this is something that concerns me deeply about the American concept of what rights are.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that if we are unequal morally,
Yeah.
then again, it has unintended consequences and second and third order effects across our entire spectrum of rights that we now enjoy.
I agree.
That the state animal farm, all animals are created equal, some are more equal than others, right? So this is the comment that I'm curious about, and I think you've articulated it well in your presentation. There's always the pressing issue, though, of how does a society that's based on negative rights meet the needs of the disenfranchised?
Yeah.
And what kind of models do you incorporate or see as the best way to do that? Because that's been this sort of noble approach, right?
Yeah.
That we want to take care of the uninsured. Of
Right.
course, in practice, the economics don't work out. We're probably going to have more uninsured than we had before the legislation passed. But what is the solution in a society built around negative rights to do that? To do the morally good thing and to try to do that, which was the impetus for setting out in the legislation in the first place.
Yeah. So I'm not a policy guy, so
Sure. But
my,
philosophically, you have ideas, right, Mark?
what's that?
You have some ideas philosophically about how a
I
society might
do,
approach
but at
it.
the end of the day, lots of those questions really are empirical questions that, I'm no more capable than anybody else who has ideas to make judgments about. A lot of it does end up being empirical questions that sort of we need to try institutions and find out.
Mm-hmm.
So what I will say is this, that what strikes me in thinking about this is that in general it's pessimistic to think that where we see a need, the right thing to do is to legislate to meet that need. Legislation doesn't meet needs. Laws requiring that the poor be fed don't feed the poor. Food feeds the poor, not laws. And so there's always a question. So let's think a little bit maybe about the food case first, and then I'll see if I can go on from there. So notice what we don't do is think that we need a federal agency that's responsible for providing food to poor people. Now there in fact are lots and lots of welfare provisions. Some of those are more intelligent than others. Some are just really stupid. And at the same time, of course, we do have lots of policies that make food more expensive. Precisely the food that poor people really want is more expensive as a result. But they can't eat laws. At the end of the day, they can only eat food that people grow. We have, by and large, a distorted but private market in agriculture and the production of food. And so we're successful in feeding the poor, partly because ventures in voluntary, private, sort of capitalistic arrangements in growing food have been so unbelievably successful in providing cheap food that we don't have people going hungry. I mean, I'm not saying there's no hunger. We certainly don't have people starving in this country, and we haven't for a long time. So we've done a pretty good job at solving, not entirely, but certainly compared with the way that most human beings have fared throughout human history, up until the last 200 years. Right? Throughout all of human, however long it is that human beings have been around, was it 100,000 years, 2 million years, I don't even know. The hominids have been around. Right? Through most of that time, people have lived at a subsistence level. And 250 years ago, that was the way that most people lived. It's still the case that some people live that way now. But a significant part of the human population does not. That's the interesting thing. We have figured out ways of lifting people out of poverty and subsistence. And that's the news. How have we done that? We've not done that by passing laws that say people aren't going to go hungry. So I think something like that model is attractive to me for healthcare. It's more complex, because obviously the provision for healthcare is more complex. We all basically need to eat, calories and, proteins and fats and carbohydrates. We're all pretty similar in that way. Obviously our needs for healthcare are very heterogeneous and individual. So there's going to be, and our capacity to provide it is very different. But before healthcare got institutionalized in our laws, like the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a substantial amount of private organization to provide healthcare. Now, the level of healthcare that was available was incredibly primitive relative to what we can do today, much cheaper. But nonetheless, there were lots and lots of voluntary associations oriented towards meeting the healthcare needs of the poor. And I'm thinking of fraternal organizations. There's a really wonderful study done by a book by a historian at the University of Alabama, David Beta. I'm not going to think of the name of it now. But Beto went back and looked at the arrangements that people made, not just for health care, but for example for death benefits and so forth, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And there was a really robust development of lots and lots of fluorescence, of lots and lots of voluntary arrangements to make sure that people had what medical care was available, death benefits, widows and children's benefits, like for minors, for the working poor, right? These fraternal organizations, you guys are probably you were certainly a generation younger than me. When I grew up, I watched the Flintstones. Have you guys ever seen the Flintstones? Yeah. And Fred and Barney were always going to the lodge. And I was thinking, what's the lodge? You guys remember offhand what lodge they're members of? I don't remember. But we've got the elks and the moose. And, I'm sorry?
Was it water buffalo?
It might be Order of the Water Buffalo. Yeah,
Water Buffalo.
that sounds right. So I was saying, what's with this lodge business? Well, these lodges are a holdover that would have been recognizable in the 50s and 60s when people were starting to write the Flintstones cartoons. They're holdovers from the 19th century. They're fraternal organizations of people that banded together precisely to address these needs. And until the 30s, until the New Deal, when the AMA was one of the responsible agencies, right, for cartelizing the provision of health insurance and constraining voluntary arrangements that these fraternal organizations made with healthcare providers to provide healthcare. They were doing a pretty decent job. Now, it's an empirical question whether those kinds of voluntary arrangements could handle the complexity of the healthcare world that we have today. I don't know. But on the other hand, what we look at here is so distorted from being an arrangement of market-provided services and consumption that I think it's really difficult to make any claims about what would or would not be the case if we left it up to voluntary arrangements. I just think what we know is when you have voluntary arrangements, we're pretty good at meeting people's needs. And number two, the other thing we're good at is experimentation. We're good at discovering ways of solving problems that may not be available at the outset, discovering ways of solving problems that are better than the solutions that we've come to so far, When you pass laws, you regiment experimentation. Now, unless you have federalism and experiments at the state level or something, you don't have the robust kind of experimentation that you have in other parts of the market that are really effective at meeting people's needs. So I think inductively, that seems to me like a smart bet to say, let people choose the arrangements that they want. And the fact is, we don't like seeing people starve. We don't like seeing people bleed out on the street. Right? That's mostly what we're like. If we see people that are in need of care, we'll find a way to provide it. I don't know why we would think that all of a sudden, we're just going to be walking by people that need, some guy's got appendicitis, we're just going to let him writhe in the gutter. We're not like that. So I don't see any reason to be pessimistic about the choices that we would make individually to collaborate to see the poor get their needs met, at least as well as they do now. We certainly don't serve them well now. They're sicker with Medicaid than they are without it. So passing laws doesn't make health easy. No, is that do anything?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a little different view. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and the only difference I see that you're saying that passing laws does not feed the people. But in this country, compared to other nations around the world, in this country, the unique thing is the laws actually do work, and the laws are followed, and the laws make.
We're mostly compliant with law.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
So the laws are effective in relation to some places like Russia or the other European countries. So they are contributory.
No, that's a valid point. And I don't mean to suggest that there's no way that thinking about effective laws or legal institutions and how to shape those, because we are going to operate. You're right. We better be operating within some laws and legal institutions, and we better get that right. So I don't want to be suggesting that. What I want to say is, if we want people to be fed, right, it's not going to work for us to say, here and now, our policy, our law is people will be fed.
And that's precisely how it works. It's not the goodness of your heart. You're not the one walking down the aisle and seeing the homeless man starving. You're not the one giving the food. It's those laws that are in place with those standards.
The laws don't feed them. Farmers feed them, right?
But it's the policy and the law.
No, it's not the farmer. How does the food go from the farmer to the starving person?
Somebody subsidized by the United States government.
There we go. Okay.
And gets thrown at
so the money has to come from someplace,
Absolutely.
right? And the food has to come from someplace, right? But it's not right. The food has to be grown. The government doesn't provide it.
It's not the goodwill of the farmers. You understand?
No, that's right. It's not. They grow it for their own. They grow the food for their own. This is Adam Smith. They're looking out for their own benefit when they do that, right? So so we agree on that. My point is that if the food is not there, the law doesn't provide it. And if farmers weren't effective at growing food, passing laws saying that people are not going to go hungry wouldn't do anything. We have laws also that say, right, people may not produce or consume marijuana. Those laws do nothing, right, about marijuana consumption. We have all kinds of laws. While we are by and large a law-respecting country, we can see that there are all kinds of laws that are systematically disregarded, right? So to some extent, it depends on the content of the laws. So two things that I'll stop. I was going to say, number one is, again, as an armchair, I'm not in the health providing service business, healthcare providers. Right? You guys are going to be. So I think you will have a perspective on this that consumers like me won't. And so I think that, sort of going back to the idea of sort of the Benjamin Rush Society and thinking about this, you have a perspective on this as providers that American consumers don't. But part of this, I think, aside from the consumer side, and that's an important side, I think there's questions about the provider side. And there's increasing numbers of practitioners, existing practitioners, that are planning on leaving medicine because they don't want to practice under these constraints. Sometimes for financial reasons, other times because they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with their arms. So it's not the case, right, that rationing healthcare that way makes sure you're not rationing a fix. The pie's going to get smaller, right? That's that's the worry. And you guys are part of that pie, right? I'm the pie eater, so I'm in a different position. But I think that's the perspective. Thank you. It's fun.
Thank you.